We're a big happy family of 7 from today. If you disobey me, we're getting a divorce. My husband suddenly came home with his mother, older sister, and her 4 children and announced this with a joyful look on his face. Ignoring my bewildered reaction, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law made themselves at home. I had imagined my mother-in-law coming to live with us, but I never expected my sister-in-law and her children to move in as well. Then my sister-in-law spoke to me with a chuckle. I got divorced from my husband, so I'm going to live here. I was surprised to hear about the divorce, but seeing how my sister-in-law never did any housework, I could understand why her husband might have kicked her out. My husband, who was carrying his mother's and sister-in-law's luggage, yelled at me. "Don't just stand there, help us. I told you, if you don't listen to me, we're getting a divorce." My husband spoke with a smug look on his face, and I answered him clearly. "I have no intention of obeying you, so I definitely want a divorce." My husband froze for a moment, then replied in a panicked voice. "Huh? What are you talking about?" My mother-in-law and sister-in-law also heard our conversation, and they were both surprised. "You were the one who said you divorced me if I disobeyed you. So, since I disobeyed you, I'm leaving and getting a divorce." I said that, and if I were to leave my in-laws' house, my husband and his family would be in a lot of trouble. My name is Chelsea, and I'm a 32-year-old office worker. I got married 2 years ago, and I've been living with my husband's father, Brian, in my husband's family home. My mother-in-law, Heather, had moved out of the family home and was living with my sister-in-law, Sarah's family, making my husband's family situation quite complicated. By the time I married my husband, Ken, and moved into the family home, his mother was already living with his older sister's family. When I asked my husband why his mother had moved out, he wouldn't give me a straight answer. My father-in-law always seemed to be in a bad mood, and I found it difficult to talk to him. Seeing my hesitation, my father-in-law spoke to me. Heather left because she couldn't stand me yelling at her. She never did any housework and just went out to play all the time. When I scolded her, she immediately left. I was shocked to learn the truth. My husband had told me that his father was an annoying person, but I never imagined it was so bad that his mother had to leave. I started to worry. Heather couldn't stand it, so will I be okay living with such an annoying father-in-law? However, when I started living with him, Brian never complained to me and was very accommodating. He ate all the meals I prepared without leaving anything behind, and he took care of his personal needs himself. It was true that he always had a grumpy look on his face, but in reality he wasn't actually angry. Father isn't annoying at all. Why did Heather get so angry? When I asked my husband, he still wouldn't give me a clear answer. Judging from my husband's reaction, he seemed to be taking his mother's side, and it seemed like he didn't want to tell me the truth. I was curious, so I decided to ask Brian directly. Ken probably doesn't want to tell you the truth either. That woman has been attached to her mother since she was a child. Brian laughed and told me the reason why Heather left. It turned out that Heather had secretly gotten into debt, and when Brian found out, he got angry. Heather was a stay-at-home mom and had been overspending for a long time. Brian managed the finances. Brian gave Heather an allowance every month, but it wasn't enough for her, so she resorted to borrowing money. And it wasn't from a regular financial institution, but from a shady place. One day, debt collectors showed up at the family home. Some scary guys came barging in yelling. I was really surprised. Brian said this with a laugh, but my husband apparently got scared and ran away. The debt collectors demanded that Brian pay back the debt, since Heather, a stay-at-home mom, couldn't repay it. Knowing that Brian had already retired, the debt collectors demanded that he use his retirement money to pay them back. They probably lent the money to your mother-in-law knowing they could target my retirement money from the start. I was surprised to hear Brian talk about it like it was someone else's problem. If it were me, I probably would have given in to the scary people's demands, but Brian argued with the debt collectors. Your debt collection methods are illegal, aren't they? And the interest is too high. The debt collectors insisted on immediate repayment, but Brian stood his ground. I'm not going to talk to small fries like you. Bring someone higher up. When Brian said that, the debt collectors backed down, and they came back later with a more reasonable interest rate. Since it was true that Heather had borrowed money, Brian paid off the entire debt. But Heather didn't thank Brian and silently moved in with Sarah's family. Sarah's family consists of her husband and 4 children. Her husband is a very quiet man. I've met him a few times, and he always seemed to be under Sarah's thumb. Sarah, Amanda, always has an unpleasant look on her face, and unlike my kind father-in-law, she's a mean-spirited person. When I first came to my husband's family home to formally greet them after our engagement, Amanda approached me with a smirk. I wonder why Ken chose such an unattractive person. Are you sure you don't have bad eyesight? Even when I was spoken to like that, my husband just stood there with an awkward expression, unable to stand up to Amanda. Instead, Brian immediately scolded Amanda, but Heather just laughed along. Amanda, you shouldn't say such things, even if they're true. You shouldn't say it out loud, especially in front of the person. Brian got angry at Heather's words too, but it didn't seem to affect them. My husband remained silent, and I started to worry about whether I should really marry into this family. However, my husband had told me that his mother had moved in with his sister's family and wouldn't be returning to the family home. It seemed that Heather, having had her debt paid off by Brian, felt awkward around him and wouldn't come back unless there was a special occasion. It seemed that she had to make an effort to return to her husband's family home because I had come to formally greet them as a new bride. After hurling insults at me, Heather and Amanda left, saying that Brian would get angry at them. Brian apologized for their rude behavior, but my husband just looked relieved that his mother and sister were gone. I started living in my husband's family home with a sense of unease, but it was true that neither Heather nor Amanda showed their faces. Brian, who had retired from his job, was always home, so neither Heather nor Amanda would come near the house. I was happy about that, but my husband seemed concerned about his mother and sister, and he would go to Amanda's house every day. I asked if I should go with him, but he told me to stay and keep his father company. "We're a bother to Dad. You can take care of him for us." I felt sorry for Brian, who was being mistreated as a nuisance by his own family. At first, I was scared of Brian, but now I rely on him more than my husband. My husband always says whatever is convenient for him, and I'm constantly being dragged around by him. The reason we ended up living with my in-laws was ostensibly because Brian was worried about his mother leaving the house. In reality, my husband's income was low, and we couldn't afford to rent a place of our own. My salary could have covered it, but my husband insisted on living in his parents' house. On top of that, Heather and Amanda, who didn't want to take care of Brian, encouraged us to live there, and my husband happily agreed. I'm such a good son, taking care of my father who is left alone. My husband said this with a joyful expression, but never helped at all. Instead, Brian would prepare dinner for me when I came home late. When I rushed home, my husband would only complain and never offered to help Brian. We started living at my husband's family home to save on rent, but then my husband said something strange to me. "Since you're living in my parents' house, it's only fair that you pay me rent. You get to live in a spacious house thanks to me, so pay up." It's true that I was living in his parents' house, but it was strange that I had to pay him rent. "If I have to pay rent, then you should pay for living expenses. You haven't paid anything lately, have you?" When I retorted, my husband looked frustrated, and he stopped demanding rent after that. However, he still didn't contribute to the living expenses. It seemed that Brian had overheard our conversation and he apologized to me. Ken isn't paying for living expenses. Like his mother, he's probably spending money on useless things. Brian offered to contribute more to the living expenses. However, I was managing to make ends meet with my salary, so I declined for the time being. My husband and father-in-law wouldn't tell me the details, but it seemed that Heather's debt was caused by her buying unnecessary brand name items. Brian was quite angry about Heather's wasteful spending, so he directly confronted my husband about it. My husband listened to Brian's words in silence, but afterward, he took it out on me. "It's your fault that I got scolded by Dad. You told him that I wasn't paying for living expenses, didn't you?" My husband yelled at me. I told him I didn't say anything, but he didn't believe me. It seemed that my husband had also been scolded for not helping with housework, and he believed that it was all my fault that his father had gotten angry at him. Brian had scolded my husband for my sake, but it ended up causing me trouble. I was getting angry at my husband's attitude, but I also had my complaints about Heather and Amanda's behavior. Amanda's family lived near my husband's family home, so my husband often went to visit them. My husband never invited me along, so he usually went home. However, occasionally, my husband would drag me along to Amanda's house. "Chelsea, you came at a good time. I was just about to start cleaning, so I'll leave it to you." Heather spoke as if my visit was a coincidence, but my husband had forced me to come along. When I looked inside Amanda's house, I was met with a shocking sight of scattered trash. "Okay then, we'll leave the cleaning to Chelsea. My mom and I will take care of the kids, so we can't help." Amanda said that and left the house with Heather and the children. I was dumbfounded, wondering why I had to clean Amanda's house. As I was standing there, my husband was also smirking and about to leave. "Chelsea is good at cleaning, so it'll be fine. Don't tell Dad about this. He might get mad at me again if he finds out." I was about to leave Amanda's house when she stopped me. When she asked what was going on, I told her that Heather had ordered me to clean. I thought she might try to hide it, saying that I had refused to tell Brian about it. I wasn't a cleaning service, so why did I have to clean Sarah's house? If she wanted to clean, she should do it herself. When I yelled that at my husband, Heather and Amanda must have heard, because they came back. A bride should just shut up and obey. Since I, the mother-in-law, am living here, consider this Ken's family home and clean it. Heather said some nonsense. Amanda also chimed in with a laugh. "That's right, Chelsea. Just listen to Mom and do as you're told. Stop complaining and start cleaning." Then, Heather and Amanda left again with the children. I noticed that my husband had already disappeared. I had no choice but to start cleaning. I wondered if Amanda didn't cook, as the sink was overflowing with instant noodle cups and takeout containers. The floor was also covered in trash, and I couldn't believe that she was living with her children in such a filthy environment. I wondered if her husband didn't say anything to Amanda. He seemed like a quiet person, so I assumed he was probably just enduring it. I also noticed that Heather was living there too, so I imagined he must feel quite cramped. Brian wasn't worried about that too. Amanda's children always seem to be reserved around their mother. It's a bit sad. I'm worried about their future. Brian said that like a soliloquy, but I felt the same way. While I was thinking about that and cleaning, by the time I had finished tidying up the kitchen, Heather and Amanda had returned with the children. See, Chelsea, you can do it when you try. From now on, clean before the trash overflows, okay? I was stunned by Heather's words. She should be saying that to Amanda. I was at a loss for words, as I was not a resident of that house. Amanda said something equally absurd. Next time, I'll have you clean the living room. When can you come and clean next? While cleaning the kitchen, I had glanced at the living room and noticed that it was also filled with trash. I had a feeling that I would be forced to clean the other rooms as well, but hearing it said so casually made me angry. However, I knew that if I refused to clean here, they would definitely not let it go. My husband was unreliable, so I decided to ask Brian for help. I'll contact you after confirming my schedule. I'm going home for today. I gave a forced smile and left Amanda's house. I was furious at the sheer audacity of Heather and sister-in-law. When I returned to my in-laws' house, Brian noticed my distress. It seemed like you went out with Ken, Chelsea. Where did you go? When Brian asked me that, I ended up telling him that I had been forced to clean Amanda's house. My husband had told me to keep it a secret, but I couldn't hold back, thinking about how I would be made to clean again in the future. Upon hearing my story, Brian turned bright red with anger and immediately bowed his head in apology. I'm so sorry, Chelsea. I didn't realize those two were such terrible people, and Ken is just pathetic for going along with them. I was worried that if Brian complained to Heather and Amanda, they would take it out on me. However, it seemed that Brian was considering my position. He suggested that the next time I was asked to clean, he would go with me to Amanda's house. That day, my husband asked about my schedule, so I told him I would go to Amanda's house again on my next day off. I also informed Brian about it. The following week, when Brian and I visited Amanda's house together, Heather and Amanda were flustered. Why did you come too, Father? Chelsea was the only one with business here. While Amanda was saying that, Heather disappeared somewhere. I came to see my grandchildren's faces, and coincidentally, Chelsea also came to visit. What did you come for, Chelsea? Brian asked me that, feigning ignorance. I was about to answer that I was asked to clean by Heather and Amanda when Chelsea invited us to a meal. We thought it would be nice to eat together, so we called her over. Amanda hastily interrupted me. Brian and I suppressed our laughter at Amanda's obvious panic. Then my husband appeared. Chelsea, were you cleaning properly? Remember, I told you to keep quiet about this to Dad. My husband, unaware that his father was there, said that. Amanda tried to kick my husband out of the house. But before she could, Brian spoke up. What do you want me to keep quiet about? You're all going out for a meal, it seems. What about you, Ken? My husband was so shocked to see his father that he jumped. When I burst out laughing at my husband's reaction, Amanda looked at me with a scowl. What are you saying, Ken? Are you still half asleep? Amanda desperately tried to smooth things over, but Brian started scolding her after surveying the inside of the house. Are you raising your children in a house full of trash like this? We're going to eat later. We need to clean up together first. Amanda couldn't argue with Brian's remark, so we all ended up cleaning the house together. My husband, who didn't want to clean, tried to sneak away, but Brian didn't let him. Ken, you need help too. My husband reluctantly helped clean after being told off by his father. Amanda also cleaned begrudgingly, and even the children helped while complaining. It was Amanda's own house, so she and her children should have been the ones cleaning, but seeing them clean so reluctantly made me irritated. Amanda and my husband, who were supposed to be pushing the cleaning on me, tried to escape at the sight of trash. Brian knew this and didn't leave their side, so they couldn't do anything. By the time the whole house was tidy, it was lunchtime, so Brian suggested having lunch. I'll go buy some lunch boxes. Chelsea, please give me some money. Amanda said that casually. Brian looked displeased. Amanda, you're inviting everyone to a meal but expect Chelsea to pay for it? Amanda looked frustrated when she heard that, but took my husband and with her to buy lunch boxes. I figured she would probably make him pay for it. While waiting for Amanda and my husband, Brian and I tried to talk to the children, but all four of them were just playing games. They didn't even smile while playing games, and it didn't seem very childlike. Brian asked the eldest child about Amanda's husband, but he didn't say anything. When I was forced to clean last time, her husband wasn't there, and he was absent again today. I wondered if he had grown tired of Amanda, who didn't do housework and made the house a mess, and had left. Brian seemed worried too. When Amanda and my husband returned with the lunchboxes, Brian asked her about it. He's at work, so don't worry about it. He's working hard because we have a mortgage. Amanda said that, but I couldn't believe her. After lunch, when Brian and I were about to leave, my husband said he would stay at Amanda's house for some reason. I thought he was probably planning something bad again. don't cause any more trouble for Chelsea. My husband played dumb when his father said that, but his expression gave him away. Amanda also denied it, but I was scared that my husband and sister-in-law might try to retaliate against me. Still, I thought that with Brian there, Amanda and my husband wouldn't be able to do anything. I had been afraid of Brian when I first got married, but he had helped me out this time too. On the other hand, I regretted marrying my husband and was seriously considering our future. Around that time, Brian suddenly fell ill and was hospitalized. He said he was feeling lethargic, so I suggested he get checked at the hospital, and he ended up being admitted immediately. After a thorough examination, they found cancer, and he was given 6 months to live. Chelsea, are you planning to stay with Ken and me even after I'm gone? It's embarrassing to say this as his parent, but it might be better for you to leave him soon. Brian spoke to me while I was taking care of him in his hospital room. Even though he had just been given a 6-month prognosis, he was worried about me. He knew that once he was gone, Heather and Amanda would mistreat me and my husband wouldn't help me. I wanted to leave my husband as soon as possible, as Brian suggested, but I decided to take care of Brian until the end. When I went to the hospital, my husband was getting ready to go out, dressed nicely. Are you going to see Dad too? When I asked him that, my husband went out smirking. He also seemed to be constantly texting someone on his smartphone. I casually mentioned this to Brian, and he suggested that I have him investigated. I was curious, so I followed Brian's advice and had my husband's actions investigated. Just like my husband, Heather and Amanda never visited Brian in the hospital, even though they knew he only had 6 months to live. Amanda's husband came to visit a few times, but even the children never showed up. Brian wanted to see his grandchildren one last time, so I talked to my husband about it. Why don't you bring your sister's children to the hospital for a visit? You should be able to do at least that much, don't you think? I thought that if Amanda couldn't bring the children, my husband could do it instead. I thought my husband could manage that since I wouldn't ask Amanda directly, but I was wrong. My sister's kids hate Dad, so there's no way they'd go see him. Besides, is Dad really going to die in 6 months? My husband was more concerned about Brian's condition than getting the children to visit. You can see for yourself, can't you? You, his son, haven't visited him even once. Even when I raised my voice, my husband didn't go to see his father. Still, he seemed concerned about his father's condition. I thought he was about to say something when he started talking on the phone with someone. I'll inherit the whole house, you know. I'm taking care of my hospitalized father, so it's only natural that I get everything. Judging from my husband's tone, I figured he was talking to Amanda. I was taking care of Brian, but my husband claimed that he was the one looking after him, which made me angry. I was close by, but my husband didn't notice me. He continued, "It's a relief that Dad got cancer. He always took Chelsea's side, which got us in trouble." I assumed he was talking about the time I was made to clean Amanda's house. I was furious to hear my husband say that he was glad his father got cancer. 6 months is a pretty long time. I wish he would pass away sooner. Hearing my husband's words, I realized that the reason he kept asking about Brian's condition was not out of concern for him. My husband was laughing happily while talking on the phone, and it made me feel sorry for Brian. Amanda seemed to be laughing on the other end of the phone as well. They were terrible children to their father. After Brian was hospitalized, Heather, who had never shown her face at the house before, started coming every day. When I came home from work after checking on Brian, Heather was always waiting for me. "Hurry up and make dinner. Where were you going until so late?" When I told her I visited Brian in the hospital, she looked at me with a mean expression. "I wonder when he's going to die. Didn't the doctor tell you anything? I'm so sick of this." I ignored my rude mother-in-law and continued preparing dinner. Then she spoke again. "You should find out how much money he has, Chelsea. I looked in his room, but I couldn't find his bank book." Heather looked troubled as she spoke, and then I understood why she was coming to the house every day. It seemed Heather was coming to look for Brian's assets, and she was frustrated that she hadn't found what she was looking for. At first, I thought she was coming to eat dinner, but her real purpose was to search for Brian's assets. I thought Heather would know more about it, but then she said something scary. "Make sure he doesn't have a strange will. Chelsea, if he wrote something like that, I'm leaving all my assets to my daughter-in-law and forced you to write it, I'll sue you immediately." I had no idea why she thought I would make him write such a will. "I don't know anything about that, so please ask Father directly. He can still talk, and he said he wanted to see you and everyone else." When I said that, Heather glared at me. Brian didn't talk about Heather, my husband, or Amanda, but he probably wanted to see them. They hadn't been on good terms, but with only 6 months to live, he must have wanted to talk about the future. Heather especially hadn't spoken to Brian in a long time, so there must have been things she wanted to discuss while she still had the chance. "Please tell your sister's children to come to the hospital with you. Your father will be happy." When I suggested that, Heather responded coldly. "I don't want to see that man's face. My grandchildren are scared of him too, so I won't bring them." Heather was more concerned about getting dinner ready quickly, so I gave up. After that, Heather continued to come to my in-laws' house, searching not only Brian's room, but the entire house, but she couldn't find any valuables. My husband was also forced to help with the search, and he complained to me about it. Dad is meticulous, so he must have hidden them somewhere we can't find. Find out from Dad where the valuables are, Chelsea. When I told my husband to ask his father directly, he got even angrier. Don't be ridiculous. You go ask him tomorrow when you go to the hospital. Hearing those words, I felt my feelings for my husband fade even more. The next day, when I went to the hospital, I told Brian that my husband and mother-in-law were searching for his valuables and will. I knew they were after my assets. Don't worry about the inheritance, Chelsea. I've taken care of it. I was relieved to hear Brian's words. Being a meticulous person, Brian had made sure that my husband and mother-in-law couldn't do anything with his assets or valuables without his permission. When I relayed Brian's words back home, my husband and mother-in-law turned bright red with anger. It's not fine at all. Why didn't you ask him for more details? My husband yelled. You're so useless as a daughter-in-law. Go to the hospital right now and ask him where he hid his bank book. I told her that visiting hours were over, and Heather looked frustrated, saying she would have to wait until the next day. Seeing Heather in a near panic made me wonder if she had gotten into debt again and was struggling financially. The next day, when I relayed Heather's desperation to Brian, he looked sad. If they are so interested in my assets, tell them to come talk to me directly. Tell them I don't have much time, so they need to hurry. Maybe then they'll show their faces. Brian said that, but he seemed to know that neither his son nor his wife would come to see him. When I got home and relayed Brian's words, Heather seemed to have given up and listened quietly. Even if Dad hid his valuables somewhere, they'll be ours once he's gone. We can inherit this house and land, so there was no need to rush. My husband was surprisingly calm, unlike before. It's true that, as my husband said, once Brian passed away, the inheritance would be split between Heather, my husband, and Amanda. It seemed that both Heather and my husband were anxious because they didn't know how much Brian had in assets. Brian's prognosis of 6 months to live was likely accurate, considering his rapidly deteriorating health. I won't give even a single penny to you, Chelsea. Don't complain later. Heather said this spitefully, but I was interested in the inheritance from the beginning. I was more upset that my husband, mother-in-law, and sister-in-law hadn't visited Brian even once, knowing his prognosis. I wanted to yell at them right then and there, but I decided to wait until all three were present. I wanted to vent all my anger at once. I was hoping to have a chance to confront them together. Unfortunately, Brian's condition worsened, and he passed away without ever seeing his son, wife, or daughter again. Even Amanda's husband, who had visited a few times, was absent. In the end, Brian passed away surrounded by me and some relatives. The relatives who rushed to the hospital were also angry at my husband, mother-in-law, and Amanda. One of the relatives told me that Brian had asked them for a favor regarding his affairs after his passing. That relative was well-versed in legal matters, so it seemed like a good choice for Brian to consult with them about his inheritance. My husband and his family left all the funeral preparations to me, which further upset the relatives. Even during the funeral, the three of them didn't seem to notice the cold stares from the relatives. They seemed to think that the funeral was irrelevant and were only interested in discussing the inheritance. Let's hurry up and finish this funeral so we can talk about the inheritance. I already told my sister, but I'm taking the house. My husband said that cheerfully. Heather and Amanda replied that they wanted cash. The funeral proceeded without incident, and the relatives offered their condolences. They thanked me for taking care of Brian in place of my useless husband, mother-in-law, and Amanda, which was a relief. I wanted to repay Brian for all his help. If it weren't for him, I would have suffered much more from the harassment of Heather and Amanda. Ideally, I wanted to repay his kindness while he was still alive, but I never imagined he would pass away so soon. After the funeral, I started thinking about my future. I no longer needed to take care of Brian, and I didn't feel the need to continue living with my husband. I also felt that Heather would likely return to the house now that Brian was gone. She had gotten her debt paid off by Brian and felt uncomfortable living there, so she had been staying at Amanda's. I figured she would come back soon, as she couldn't stay at Amanda's forever. As I was thinking about that, my husband ordered me to clean Brian's room back at the house. Mom and my sister took all the valuables, so you can throw everything else away. If you complain, I'll throw you out too. My husband said that, laughing. He was a completely different person from when Brian was alive. This was probably his true self, and he had been acting obedient only because he was afraid of his father. I thought that Heather would likely move back in, as Brian's room needed to be cleared. The room Heather used to occupy was still vacant, but it seemed like they wanted to use both rooms. After Brian passed away, my husband suddenly became bossy. Why isn't dinner ready yet? You don't have to take care of Dad anymore, so hurry up and make it. He started ordering me around and I was getting tired of it. I started to wonder what would happen when Heather moved in. But contrary to my expectations, Heather showed no signs of moving back in, which puzzled me. She had also stopped talking about Brian's assets, which she had been so obsessed with before he passed away. I thought about asking my husband, but he had become much more aggressive since Brian's death, so I decided against it. I didn't want to get yelled at for meddling in things, so I kept quiet. After some time, Heather and Amanda showed up at the house and they started talking about the inheritance. A relative was also present for the discussion and had various documents and bank books that had been entrusted to them by Brian. I wanted to be present for the discussion about the inheritance, but my husband yelled at me to leave after I served them tea. I reluctantly listened in from the next room and I could hear Heather's scream. Why don't I get anything? I should get something too, since I paid off his debts. Hearing Heather's words, I finally understood. Heather was panicking because she wasn't getting any inheritance, even though she had paid off Brian's debt. The relative explained that Heather could claim her legally reserved portion, but since she had expected to receive half of Brian's estate, she was greatly disappointed. When my husband and Amanda realized that Heather wouldn't be receiving anything, they were happy. I could hear them laughing. But soon, Amanda let out a shriek. "This is all the inheritance Dad left? Where's the rest of his retirement money?" The relative explained that most of Brian's retirement money had been used to pay off Heather's debt. Upon learning this, Amanda complained to her mother. "It's your fault that I'm only getting a small amount of money. You should pay me the money that I was supposed to receive." Amanda yelled at her mother. Heather didn't stay quiet either. "Don't be rude to your own parent. I never asked him to pay off my debts. He did it on his own, so it has nothing to do with me." It was clear that Heather had no intention of taking responsibility for creating the debt in the first place. Amanda couldn't accept this and continued to yell at her mother. The relative and my husband tried to calm Amanda down, but her anger didn't subside. Amanda then opened the door to the room where the discussion was taking place and glared at me with a furious look on her face. "Chelsea, did you know that Dad's assets were so little? You were taking care of him, so you must have heard something, right?" She suddenly questioned me, but I honestly didn't know anything, so I told her that. The relative also confirmed that I hadn't been told anything, so Amanda left the house in frustration. After Amanda left with the door open, my husband asked the relative with a joyful expression, "Am I getting the house? Dad was always relying on me, so he must have left the house to me." I didn't think Brian relied on my husband, so I doubted that would happen. The relative told my husband that he would receive cash just like Amanda, and that he could continue to live in the house. Heather, who had heard this, panicked and voiced her complaints to the relative. "Why does Ken get both money and the house when I don't get anything?" My husband, instead of the relative, answered triumphantly, "I made Chelsea take care of Dad, so he was grateful. Mom, you never visited Dad in the hospital, so he disliked you." Heather was furious when she heard my husband's words, but I was also angry and wanted to yell at him. I wasn't taking care of Brian because my husband asked me to, and not only Heather, but also my husband never visited him in the hospital. From behind the open door, my husband noticed that I was angry and spoke to me spitefully. "Thanks to me, you can continue to live in this house, Chelsea. Be grateful. From now on, I'll provide for you." My husband, who hadn't been contributing to the household expenses, said this so arrogantly that I was beyond angry. I started to wonder if he had gone insane. My husband's words made Heather even angrier, but now she turned her anger towards me. You must have badmouthed me to him and made him not leave me anything, and you made him let you stay in this house." I denied it, but Heather, who was making wild accusations, was furious and stormed off. Only my husband was smiling, and he told me to handle the inheritance paperwork and then left. The remaining relative felt sorry for me and explained the procedures in detail. I was about to explode because of my husband and his family's behavior, but the relative's words calmed me down. I followed the relative's instructions and completed the procedures, and I also started preparing for my own future. My husband was overjoyed to inherit the house from his father and went out drinking until late at night almost every day after work. After that, Heather and Amanda were no longer on good terms with my husband and stopped coming to the house. I was expecting Heather to move back into the house, so this was a welcome development as it allowed me to make various preparations without being disturbed. I wondered if Heather had given up on moving back when suddenly my husband came home with his mother, Amanda, and her 4 children. "We're a big, happy family of 7 from today. If you disobey me, we're getting a divorce." My husband said that with a joyful expression. His mother and sister started to make themselves at home, ignoring my bewildered reaction. I could imagine Heather coming to live with us, but I never expected Amanda and her children to move in as well. Then Amanda spoke to me with a chuckle. "I got divorced from my husband, so I'm going to live here." I was surprised to hear about the divorce, but seeing how Amanda never did any housework, I could understand why her husband might have kicked her out. My husband, who was carrying his mother's and sister-in-law's luggage, yelled at me. "Don't just stand there, help us." I told you, if you don't listen to me, we're getting a divorce. My husband spoke with a smug look on his face, and I answered him clearly. I have no intention of obeying you, so I definitely want a divorce. My husband froze for a moment, then replied in a panicked voice. Huh? What are you talking about? Heather and sister-in-law also heard our conversation, and they were both surprised. You were the one who said you'd divorce me if I disobeyed you. So since I disobeyed you, I'm leaving and getting a divorce. I said that, packed my bags, and prepared to leave the house. My husband didn't think I would actually go through with a divorce and was visibly flustered. What are you so flustered about, Ken? It's great that the nuisance is leaving. Amanda also glared at me. I hated Chelsea from the start. She always got on Dad's good side and acted all innocent. When the two started criticizing me, my husband seemed to regain his composure. That's right. It seems everyone's happier with Chelsea gone. I told my husband that I would bring the divorce papers later and left the house. I had already contacted my parents beforehand, letting them know I would be returning, so they welcomed me without any surprise. The next weekend, I went back to my in-laws' house to collect the rest of my belongings and get my husband's signature on the divorce papers. The house was a mess, with moving boxes still unpacked and clutter everywhere. As expected, neither Amanda nor Heather had done any cleaning, and trash was starting to pile up. It was like a completely different house from when I left. As I was about to leave, my husband spoke to me sarcastically. It's been peaceful since you left. I should have divorced you sooner. I wondered how it could be any more peaceful than before, but I kept quiet and left. After filing the divorce papers, I felt a sense of relief. I wondered why I had stayed with such a man, who didn't even help with living expenses and only spoke arrogantly. I regretted not leaving sooner, as my ex-husband had suggested. My parents and friends told me to forget about my ex-husband quickly and find someone new. I wanted to forget him too, but there were still some loose ends, so I tried to contact my ex-husband. Then my ex-husband, mother-in-law, Amanda showed up at my parents' house. I received an invoice for rent. What's going on? Did you take care of the paperwork properly? My ex-husband was flustered. I answered him. I took care of the paperwork properly, which is why you received an invoice for the rent. Didn't you know that house was a rental? Upon hearing my words, my ex-husband fell silent. Instead, my ex-mother-in-law, who had come with him, yelled, There's no way we can afford such high rent. Chelsea must have done something. My ex-mother-in-law was furious, her face bright red. I retorted, Didn't you know the rent for the house you were living in? You left all the household finances to your late father, so you don't know anything, do you? My ex-mother-in-law bit her lip, looking mortified, after I said that sarcastically. Apparently, neither my ex-husband nor Amanda knew that the house was a rental. I didn't know either until Brian told me when he was hospitalized. Even after I moved in, Brian continued to pay the rent. If my ex-husband had handled the inheritance paperwork himself, he would have realized it, but he left everything to me. You're the reason why things turned out this way, my ex-mother-in-law said, triumphantly. It seemed that Brian had anticipated this and had asked the relative not to disclose the details to them. He probably didn't trust that relative to handle such important inheritance matters. It seemed that my ex-husband was shocked to learn that the house was a rental, and Amanda started complaining. If I had known, I wouldn't have gotten a divorce. I thought if I moved back to my parents' house, Chelsea would do the housework, and you said you'd cover the living expenses, but it's completely different. It seemed that the reason Amanda divorced her husband so quickly was because she thought she could rely on me and my ex-husband. But it seemed that she had realized that my ex-husband was actually not contributing to the household expenses at all. He had been boasting about providing for me, but in reality, he hadn't paid any rent or living expenses. It seemed he was spending all his money on his affair partner. When I asked him about that, my ex-husband turned pale and stood there frozen. It was then that I decided to bring up the affair and demand compensation. I had already received the investigation report on the affair, but I had been putting it off, wanting to discuss it after things settled down a bit, since I had been busy with the move. I have evidence of the affair here. I'm going to demand compensation from both of you, and of course, I'll be asking the mistress to take responsibility as well. Upon hearing that my ex-husband was in debt, my ex-mother-in-law and Amanda were even more shocked. Ken, how much debt do you have? You said you were going to support me, so I borrowed money again. It seemed that my ex-mother-in-law had believed my ex-husband when he said he would provide for her, so she felt safe borrowing money again. Amanda also seemed to have been expecting something from my ex-husband and frantically asked him. I was planning to have Ken pay off the compensation I owe my ex-husband. Since you don't have to pay Chelsea any compensation, you can take care of my share, right? It was news to me that Amanda was also being asked to pay compensation by her ex-husband. Why don't you tell me the reason for your divorce, Amanda? Did you also have an affair? When I asked that, Amanda became angry. Don't say such rude things. I didn't do anything wrong. I just got kicked out by my husband because he couldn't stand my not doing housework and having so much debt. Amanda answered in an irritated tone, but I wondered if she wasn't ashamed. I couldn't help but think that it was natural for her to be kicked out, considering her behavior. I wondered if Amanda had any money inherited from Brian. What happened to the money you inherited from your father? You can use that money to pay the compensation, can't you? When I asked, Amanda answered in a small voice, looking away. I spent that money on meals with Mom and other things. I can't help it. When I have money, I just want to spend it. I was amazed at how irresponsible Amanda was and wondered how she would raise her 4 children. I asked if she had any debt, like my ex-husband and mother-in-law, and it turned out she had borrowed a considerable amount of money. It seemed that was also a cause of her divorce. It was sad to see that all 3 of them were so similar in their bad habits. Chelsea, now that you understand the situation, please come back quickly. My ex-mother-in-law said that and tried to take me back to the house, but my ex-husband and I were already divorced and had no relation to each other. Didn't you say that I was a nuisance and that you didn't want me around? So I'm leaving. When I said that, Amanda chimed in this time. I hated you too, Chelsea. Let's not see each other again. I don't like you either, Amanda, so I won't. It seemed like they had forgotten what they had said to me, but I remembered it clearly. When I refused to go back, my ex-husband started begging me, looking like he was about to cry. You don't have to live with us, but at least pay the rent. If you don't, we'll be kicked out of the house. It was infuriating that my ex-husband, who was already divorced from me, was demanding that I pay the rent. I'm the one who should be asking for money. I'll make sure to claim compensation, no matter how much debt you have. My ex-husband looked troubled when I got angry, but he wasn't in a state to have a proper conversation. I really wanted to have a long talk with my ex-husband about the compensation, but my ex-mother-in-law and Amanda's presence made it chaotic. I decided to let them go for the day and promised to discuss the compensation later. My ex-husband used the money he inherited from his father to pay the compensation immediately. I wondered what his motive was for paying the compensation so quickly. It turned out that he wanted to get back together with me. I paid the compensation, so let's get back together. I'll kick out my mom and sister. My ex-husband said this, laughing. It's obvious that you should pay compensation since you cheated on me. I don't want anything to do with you anymore, so don't ever contact me again. I said that and sent him away. My ex-husband wouldn't give up and came to my parents' house several times after that. I told him I would report him to the police for stalking, and he finally stopped showing up. I learned about my ex-husband and his family's subsequent situation from a relative. Since my ex-husband and his family couldn't pay the rent, they were evicted from the house and started living in a small house. It seems that Amanda's 4 children were taken by her ex-husband, which was a relief. Amanda apparently wanted to keep the children because of the child support payments, but she couldn't handle them and eventually left them with her ex-husband. Even after moving out of the house, my ex-husband and his family's debts didn't disappear, so they were struggling to repay them. Both Amanda and my ex-husband have spent all the money they inherited from Brian, so they had no choice but to work and pay it back. Amanda, who had never done housework and only played around, started working, albeit while complaining. My ex-mother-in-law also found a part-time job and started working, despite complaining that her body ached all over. It seemed that my ex-husband had been dumped by his affair partner. Until then, I had been covering their living expenses, so my ex-husband was able to use his salary freely. However, now he had to cover the living expenses himself, which meant he no longer had money to spend on his affair partner. It seemed that the affair partner wasn't serious about the relationship and was angry that I had demanded compensation, so she broke up with my ex-husband. The late father-in-law was probably stunned by the pathetic state of the 3 of them, or perhaps he had anticipated this outcome, which is why he asked a relative to handle the inheritance. It seemed that Brian had kept the fact that the house was a rental a secret from my ex-husband and Amanda because he knew they would become like this. As for Heather, it seemed she was quite angry as she hadn't received any inheritance. She had borrowed money again, despite having had her debts paid off by Brian once before, which showed that she hadn't learned her lesson. After returning to my parents' home, I continued to work as before, but my mood improved after the divorce. I no longer had any complaints about my ex-husband, and I was no longer subjected to insults or unreasonable demands from my ex-mother-in-law and Amanda. I didn't realize it myself, but my colleagues told me that I seemed brighter than before. Perhaps because of my improved mood, my colleagues started talking to me more often. I was even invited out for meals a few times, and I was enjoying my life every day. When I first got divorced, I had no intention of getting married again, but I started to feel that it might be nice to start a relationship if I met someone nice. Now that I'm single again, I want to work on myself so that I can meet someone wonderful.